Hello everybody, welcome back. It is me, Cyberwarrior. This is cyberwarriorstudios, and once again we are having a security happy hour. With me today I have Jason Hurst, and here shortly I will also have Carolina, otherwise known as Dork Phoenix on Twitter. And it's going to be an interesting show because these are people that, though I've interacted with, it's kind of two different spectrums. So Jason being military and Carolina being from Kansas City and a Chiefs fan. It'll be an interesting conversation to have. But before Carolina gets here and while we're waiting for her to join us, why don't we have Jason introduce himself, kind of what he has done and how he got into cyber and what he's doing now. And then as Carolina joins, we'll have her do the same. So go ahead, Jason. Why don't you give us a little rundown on what's going on?
All right. So I actually joined the military straight out of high school back in 2001 before the towers. And then the towers hit as I was finishing up my initial training. So basically, I've been in a wartime military my entire career. We're just now starting to pull out of Afghanistan. We're getting a lot of folks out of Iraq, but it's been an interesting 20 years. The way I got into cyber is I came in as IT. So initially working with radio spectrum equipment, I went into satellite communications. That was fun for a bit, but then I got bored. So then I became a network engineer in 2008. And then I just kind of transitioned to cyber in and around 2014. And ever since, for the last 6 years, I've been doing network forensics, a little bit of detective forensics and incident response, and some other tasks that I've been working on. So right now I teach at the Army Cyber School down in Fort Gordon, Georgia, and I'm in the process of transitioning from the military and actually start with Amazon Web Services in their one of their incident response cells here in January.
Yeah, I seen that. So I seen you're at the cyber school. I actually was a 25 Delta, so I went through Fort Gordon back in 14 or I want to say it was 14. It might have been 15. And so yeah, I know what they offer, and I'll go to bed. And it's crazy because I actually interviewed for a job down there, and back when I was retiring out 3 years ago, and it's weird because they were. I had talked to them and I thought it was going well, and I was like, yeah, I said one of the things I've never agreed with is the way they teach scanning, like network scanning and things like that, because they always teach these broad strokes, scan the entire network, scan everything. And I told the lady I was interviewing with, I was like, that's wrong. I was like, if you're doing this from a military perspective, you should be trying to be silent. And if you're not teaching how to be silent on a network and how to not get caught, then you're doing it wrong. And she goes, oh, I don't disagree with you. And then I never got a call back.
Nice.
So I was like, every course is taught it wrong. SANS, well, at least the beginner courses, SANS, CEH, like you name it, the initial instructors always teach it wrong. So yeah. But now that Carolina is connecting to audio and has been so gracious to join us this evening.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm sorry I'm late. Hi.
It's okay. It's okay. We're not mad at you. Actually, Leroy loves your Benz. I was talking to him earlier because he's in KC also, so he has seen the Benz around. And he wants to introduce himself, so we'll get to that later. I'll get if you're on Discord or whatever, we'll pull you into one of my servers so you guys can talk and brag about KC, even though Pittsburgh's better.
By one win, statistically, you can make that argument so far this
11-0 is 11-0. That's all we're gonna say.
One more win. That's all you can fucking brag, and it's only till this point in the season. So go ahead and talk some more shit. Season's not over. You do not have Patrick Mahomes, and we do.
Dude, I do
we'll
like
see how
Mahomes.
it shakes out.
I'm not even gonna get mad at it. Mahomes is a beast. I can't even deny that.
Right?
But so is Big Ben. So we'll see how things play out.
He is, but they're not same. Not same.
Two different styles. But anyways, so I have seen you a lot on Twitter, and your cybersecurity information you put out is still what always attracted me to the people I follow. Now, granted, you get your shit posting, you get your personal lives, you get everything else, but it's always the cybersecurity knowledge that I follow. I don't follow for all the other personal stuff, because it's just I'm there for cybersecurity news. Now, I occasionally like the good shit post just like anybody else, but the cybersecurity is where I grow my audience. If you're doing anything in cybersecurity, I want to see eventually what news you put out about it. And being part of Cisco is another reason. Seeing that you're part of Cisco was another reason where I was like, okay, so knowing people in different areas, different avenues, different fields and companies is always a good place to network. And so why don't you give us the rundown on how you got into cybersecurity and what you're doing now?
Okay, happily. So I've been in InfoSec for about 11 years. I started in 2009 at a company called Fishnet Security that doesn't exist anymore, is part of Optiv Security, arguably now, or you could argue that Fishtech Security is the latest iteration of that company. How I got in was my ex was in the field, and I was in retail selling cell phones, and he said, "You're too smart for this. Come check this out." And I listened. I've loved since the beginning that it's never boring. It's always different. I get easily bored and had up until that point in my career. So that is what got me to stick with it for 11 years. What I do today, I am a cybersecurity specialist at Cisco. And I've been doing that same job for about 7 years. I just switched from the public sector team at the end of May to the commercial select team. So same job, different customer base, slightly different set of problems, very similar though. I essentially look at the cybersecurity strategy of my customers and make recommendations whether they benefit me or not. As far as holes that I see, given that I have intimate knowledge of how my customers get breached. And I won't name my customers, but I will say that I took over some accounts that were very publicly breached in the last recent future. And I've been privileged to walk in after the fact and get to help clean up and make some strategic decisions. I believe pretty strongly in providing data-based support, and not database, but data-based support, meaning helping my customers figure out strategically using game theory where their strategy has maybe gone the way of the shiniest thing they saw at a booth in RSA and not necessarily the greatest coverage for their set of problems or for their network or their use case. And so I feel like that's made a difference in my career path. And I've been studying forensics as of late. I would like to maybe go the incident response route at some point down the near future road, but we'll see. So that's me. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. Nice to have you. And it's good because it's not very often, well, it's happened recently just with a few other people, but I like hearing the government side of things, because being that I was in the Army, it's good to hear from, what's kind of going on there that can actually be talked about. And then the public sector also, because eventually, I'd like to see a true collaborative effort on all parts to really bring together cybersecurity, because we have so many intelligent minds that we're still segregated, right? So we still have, I work for Cisco. Like, I've got friends that work for Apple that can't come on here because Apple is like, you have these contracts and it takes a bunch of legality. And it's like, but why? I'm not here to promote Apple or promote Cisco or anything else. I'm here so people in the field can talk about what's going on in the field. You don't have to name clients. You don't have to name your company. You just have to name yourself and what's going on. And so until we can come to that collaborative effort and not have so many things, so much bureaucracy, it's ridiculous. And so that's why I'm glad to have these.
I appreciate that. I think that one point that I'll make to that end is that a lot of people are suspicious right now of the vaccines that have been rushed to market because of COVID. And my response, given that I have a cousin in clinical research, is guess what? It's because the pharmaceutical companies put down their capitalist clause for 5 fucking minutes. Pardon my French. Am I allowed to cuss on this broadcast?
I do all the goddamn time. Don't worry about it. That's why it's 10 o'clock
and
it's not for kids.
They put down their bullshit and actually worked together for the first time in history, which is why a vaccine didn't take 4 fucking years. It took 6 months until it was in clinical trials, because nobody was as worried about proprietary information and copywriting it and making money and making profit, because the whole world needed a vaccine.
I still think they're going to find a way to capitalize on it.
I'm sure they will. But I think specifically along the issue of people distrusting how quickly it came to market, that's why. Trust it or don't trust it, fine. But it came to market in 6 months and not 4 years, because unlike the cybersecurity industry, where we still operate today, where everyone is very proprietary, you can draw a direct corollary to the way the pharmaceutical industry normally works. If there were one piece of malware that were threatening the whole world, I would like to think, based on what I've seen in the research side of our industry, that people would put their heads together and come up with a solution before they would worry about who got paid for it, in the same way that the pharmaceutical industry has done that very recently with the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, I can understand that aspect, and I don't want to bring too much of that hot topic into here just because.
Sure. I'm just saying,
it's very,
when you talk about brand differences and manufacturer differences,
but at the end of the day, I can understand where you're coming from. And if we're looking at just the cybersecurity aspect of things, it is very interesting to see that point, though, and see that correlation. But if you think about it, and to kind of bring it around to that point, WannaCry took over. When WannaCry ransomware took over, you didn't see these heads come together. You saw Apple do their own thing, Google do their own thing, Microsoft do their own thing, and it
maybe publicly. But I would argue that if you talk to the folks behind the scenes in research, like the folks at Cisco Talos, they would tell you when they find something new, the first thing they do is pick up the phone to the research people at Checkpoint and the research people at FireEye. Like, they don't care.
I've interviewed there.
On that.
I've interviewed there.
What's
That's
that?
because they're freaking intelligent. I've talked to Talos. That was actually one of my first interviews coming out of the Army. And they are some of the smartest people I've ever met. But it's still, even though they may have picked up the phone, it took one guy to really find something.
Reverse engineering it, sure. I mean, one guy obviously made the biggest difference, but I would argue that people work together in a way that's not transparent to the world, that is not public.
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, and Jason, you may have a different scene on it being in the realm that you're in within the government or within the military, of how kind of they approached it or how you approached it with your classes or whatever. But I think we try to find ways, whether it be LinkedIn, Twitter, GitHub, we find ways to interact with each other. But I still think if you look at it, we're still so far apart, where if you work with Apple, it's like, I can't tell you what we do for security. If you work with Google, I can't tell you what we do for security. And it's like, we're still holding on to this, I work for this company, I can't help you type of environment.
I don't want to dominate the conversation. I will say that I have seen enough behind the scenes at Cisco to feel like a lot of that happens out of the public eye.
Yeah. Jason, what you got, man?
No, I'd actually agree with that as well. Even on the federal side, working with a lot of commercial customers and commercial vendors and stuff, a lot of back-end discussions do occur that we have to. Hey, this is the thing we're trying to keep from continuing to break or continuing this life cycle. How do we stop it as fast as possible? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But definitely on the C-suite side, when you look at the front with leadership and you look at like the public announcements, things like that, it definitely falls apart there. That you have, it's what I've seen is it's very personality driven on the back end and everyone working towards a common effort. But you're right, when you're looking at the front end on the organizational standpoint, everyone has their own little rice bowls that they're following. and they've trapped themselves within those stovepipes of what they're allowed to say, not allowed to say,
Yeah.
even though the researchers, the technicians, the instant responders, the folks on the back end are all trying their best to collaborate with each other.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Because I have seen that, you know, when you look at open source, and as much as Microsoft even recently has gone to, and people complain about them going to Ubuntu and WSL and open source and PowerShell and all this other stuff, you're seeing a lot more of that. As you go open source, you can make changes, you can make, you can have more of a community benefit from the field. And I think I don't disagree. I think on the back end, a lot of people are picking up the phone or going to their contacts like, hey, what have you seen? But the fact that you don't see that in the public purview, or we don't have a centralized area to say, hey, what's going on? Because everything that gets put on the internet is isolated to this company putting this out, and then isolated to this. And it goes back to what you're saying, where the executives are saying, hey, this has to be our product. It has to be our idea, not, hey, as a collective, this is what we found. So I think that's huge.
I think our way of handling that is a little bit friendlier than it is, you know, going back to my original point in the pharmaceutical industry, because our industry is so much younger and telemetry is different and valuable, and we all see different shit, and our teams specialize in different things, and I think it's much more collaborative in general than what we've seen in other industries, for instance the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, I don't disagree, because like you said though, publicly we have to say, hey, we work for this company, us as a company found this, when the reality of it is, I called my buddy at X company, he gave me an idea, or you know, I met this guy at B-Sides or DEF CON, and sometimes they don't get the credit for helping, but the reality of it is they help. They put them in the right direction of, hey, did you look at X, Y, and Z?
Well, some good examples
I
of that.
I would say,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, some good examples of that are security researchers. Even recently, hey, Google, hey, Apple, we found a Wi-Fi exploit that was found on iPhone 11 devices recently, where you could use a Wi-Fi directional antenna and take over any iPhone 11 iOS from short to medium distance. That was shared with a researcher with Apple as part of bug bounty and things like that. So bug bounty programs, there's even just security researchers, hey, 0 day, realizing knight in shining armor kind of thing. Hey, this is going to be a really, really bad day if this gets out. So definitely that collaboration is happening, but it's definitely not necessarily on a coordinated scale. It's more because of our culture that as cybersecurity, we're all kind of interconnected with one another.
Yep.
It's not like old town days where, okay, you send a letter and it takes like a week to get across the country. Now I shoot an email and it's there in maybe a couple minutes, depending on the security and latency. So with that interconnectedness, I think there's a lot of that. You have the pen testers, the defenders, you even have the offenders and the gray hats, I guess you'll call them, that are flipping back and forth. They're helping sometimes, hurting sometimes, but again, it's more personality driven, I think, than a coordinated, we will control this thing. Because again, it's not like you can put a patent on, all right, this section of the internet belongs to me. Russia's been trying to do it. China's been trying to do it, and people are just finding ways around it. So through that collaboration and that finding ways around it, it's not just around the securities that are in place, but it's also trying to protect the things that are in place too as a community.
Yeah, I agree. It's weird because the way some of this communication happens, sometimes it's a matter of going on LinkedIn and saying, hey, this is what I'm working on, or going on Twitter and saying, hey, I need help with this. I'm not going to lie. I got help with Python by saying, hey, I'm struggling with this script not working. And so seeing that aspect of things and seeing the collaboration that certain people are willing to bring, but that then we still have, and I'm sure you guys can attest to, we still have those people that are so hell-bent on not sharing tribal knowledge and not sharing the knowledge that they've gained over, you know, whatever studies, and are like, well, if I let this go, then I lose my spot in this, you know, space. I can't let it go. And it's not as often as anymore, but I still see it where people aren't sharing information.
On an individual basis, I would agree with that assessment. I would say, as far as the threat research groups go, that doesn't seem to be a thing. I mean, like, if they find something uniquely that they have everything they need to know and they're ready to publish on it, fine. But I still feel like the friends that I have, you know, again, I keep coming back to Talos because that's my tribe. But when I talk to those people, like, not a single one of them has ever said anything that would make me think that they were hoarding data for the sake of being proprietary or having their name appear on a byline somewhere. They all seem very concerned about solving a problem and stopping the bad guys. Like, legit, that's their only goal. And I just, like I said before, I think there's a lot of back-end communication between the threat intel groups. Maybe not individual people, fine, if they discover a thing by themselves, but I think the threat intel groups communicate a lot more than most people realize, and share data and information and theories and research in a way that most people don't.
So
it's why every time I see a threat intel slide from a vendor, including us, in a presentation, I want to puke in my shoes, because I'm like, who the fuck cares how many bajillion samples a day we see? Yeah, okay, congrats, you're right. But the first thing that we do when we see some shit is pick up the phone and call our competitors and share intel to make sure we're all fighting the bad guys. So who the fuck cares? Yeah. So I think that happens more than most companies would like to admit.
I do too, but I think that's because they're trying to protect themselves. And I do think from the group standpoint, they do. But from the individual standpoint, some of them, and it's getting fewer and far between. Don't get me wrong. We are collaborating a lot more recently than maybe in past years. But I do think there are still those out there that are like, oh, I'm not going to share information because I found this. It's mine.
Sure.
I want to take credit.
I get it. I think we all have our own niche, like, you know, depending on the vendor and the researcher and your perspective on data, like, you still need more to complete the picture. And yeah, you could publish on your own little corner of the world, but at the end of the day, if you're not painting a complete picture to tell people how to protect themselves, which involves the knowledge of inherently of other people, you're doing the world a disservice, and fuck all of that pride-based bullshit.
I don't disagree. I don't. So on the knowledge of that, what can we do? And I ask this almost every episode. What can we do to get ahead? Right? Because we're always behind. Always. There's always something wrong that we don't find that the bad guys find. What can we do to get ahead? Because we're not allowed to do anything illegal, so you can't just go out there and break into things. You can't just go out there and dissect Windows source code, right? So what can we do to get ahead without breaking the law, if it's even possible?
Jason, I'll let you go first because I have strong opinions about that.
Well, I do too, because even most recently, the CPRA that was passed in California is a good example of where they're following the GDPR standards from Europe. And that's going to have global implications for white cell researchers that, hey, did you get permission from the customer before you looked for these 0 days or these exploits on the internet? Well, no, that's a misdemeanor offense. Like, they're creating laws and standards that are disincentivizing that process and intentionally pushing away from researching and trying to proactively find those faults. And unfortunately, it's only going to affect the folks that are trying to help, because the bad guys are still going to do it regardless. Yay, you made a new law and you made it a misdemeanor, and some individuals over in Ukraine doing it. Guess what? They're outside jurisdiction. They don't care. They're going to keep doing it. But then you have the individual that's in the United States that's trying to help and finds a 0 day or is doing a bug bounty or something like that. And now you're prosecuting this individual just because the way they went about it is they discovered this thing and they were trying to report it to the company but by reporting it to the company, you're now fining them for a misdemeanor. So I think some of our laws, the Computer Security Act of 1974, as well as the new California law that stood, I think those, based on how they're going to go through the legal system, I think those are incredibly dangerous for the cyber community, just because we're definitely, there is the potential there to heavily stifle innovation and cripple defensive research, and where we're basically at the whim of the adversaries almost.
I would agree with that. So I feel like any world that exists in which we operate under a set of rules and the bad guys operate under no rules, under the premise of chaos, we are always going to be behind, period. That's just, there's no way getting around it. As long as we operate within a set of rules, they know what those rules are, they can subvert those rules whether we like it or not, because they don't operate under any appreciable structure, and they aren't trying to follow any laws or policies because they're the bad guys. By default, they're doing whatever the fuck they want all the time. So I think we are perpetually always going to be behind. It's always going to be a moving target, and it's always going to be a matter of figuring out their latest techniques and trying to subvert them one step behind, and not allowing them to scale. I think that's the best we can really hope for, arguably, is figuring out their techniques and thwarting them before they can attack everyone. I think it's arguably probably the best we can do. The closest I've seen to the idea of getting ahead of them is when I saw multiple presentations at DEF CON by DARPA in how to use artificial intelligence to anticipate and block attacks based on using pure, straight-up supercomputer-based AI. And that's not scalable for everyone, or 99% of everyone. And thus, until they can figure out how to make that a legitimate defense technique where, okay, it sees a vulnerability and it patches it in real time. Like, I've seen some crazy shit at presentations that like blew my mind, but it was very fringe and it was very cutting edge, and it was not by any stretch of the imagination the norm. And again, I feel like as long as we are limited by a set of rules, whether they be laws or policies within engagements or within the companies in which we operate, and the bad guys have no rules, will always operate at a disadvantage.
All right, cool. We're on the same page on that one then. That there's really because no, the reality of it is you're right. So, and it goes back to my experience in the military and what I'm sure a lot of other people have seen in the military. The biggest complaint is you're putting so many people behind boundaries, behind laws, behind red tape, that the bad guys don't operate in that same spectrum. They don't care. And I'm gonna bring something up I very rarely do, but it comes down to, again, this is another touchy subject, but I'm gonna say it. The Second Amendment, when you talk about the right to bear arms, and they talk about, people always want to say, well, I don't agree with guns, and some people say, well, I agree with guns, but not so much. If you take them away, that's fine, go ahead. But the bad guys don't care anyways. The bad guys are still going to get them. They're still out there. There's no way around that. So when you look at limiting what us as security researchers can do, if you tell us we can't do something, okay, we're going to abide by those laws, but the bad guys aren't. They're not going to care. They haven't cared, and it's not going to change. Anything you do to restrict the good guys just means the bad guys have more free reign to do whatever they want, because now we can't do our jobs.
That being said, I feel like the difference between us and the bad guys is the rules and following the rules.
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's the fucking difference. And I will say, to your point about the Second Amendment, I own a gun and I'm a happy target shooting gun owner. I do feel like there's more that can be done, and I think there are a lot of gun owners who will argue, not to like bring up open a sack of cats, that there's more that can be done. Like, if you could track malware with a serial number and realize who used it in each state because of the serial number, you would beg for that. You would demand that.
Yeah.
Law enforcement for years has been begging for any kind of interstate serial number based gun tracking system, so that when a bad guy goes and buys a gun in another state and uses it in a crime, you can track it back to the dealer who dealt it to him and hold him accountable.
Yeah.
And I feel like they're not quite the same because, you know, that you're talking about very different rights. But yeah, I mean, the difference between us and the bad guys when it comes to security is that we follow rules and they don't. Yes, it makes us operate by default at a disadvantage, but that's because we're operating with morals and they're not. And I will continue to happily operate in that space, regardless of whether that puts us at a disadvantage or not.
And so you mentioned morals. And I did. I used to think the bad guys, well, most of the bad guys had morals. I did.
No, they do not.
Well, my assumption was they went after money, right? So they'd go after the corporations or whatever. But more and more and more, what's the target? Hospitals,
healthcare,
education.
Yep.
And it blows my mind because I did. For years, everything I saw was about bring down the corporation, bring down the structure, bring down the government, bring down all this other stuff. And I was like, I don't agree with it, but I understand where you're coming from. Whereas now it's, hey, we're going to target healthcare and PHI, and we're going to target now schools and kids and their information. And that's where I'm like, I swear I could have sworn at one point Black Hats had a standard of we're going after corporate greed and these companies that have all this money, not healthcare and schools. And then in the past year, the influx of hospitals and schools that have been breached and held for ransom has blown my mind.
So two things about that. One, it depends on the group, right? So you will have groups like the one who breached the German hospital who once people said, like, yo, you didn't breach just a college, you breached a hospital too. They were like, out. Oh shit, our bad. And they gave them the decryption keys.
Yeah. I did a video
and then you have the groups that design things like Bobek, which was ransomware designed specifically for fucking healthcare. So you can't begin to claim that that group didn't have healthcare in mind. And then I will, I'm not a doomsday cybersecurity person by any stretch of the imagination, but I will say that I feel like ransomware in healthcare has just touched the tip of the iceberg. Right now, it's about holding medical records hostage and pointing almost a toy gun at their heads and saying, well, oh, you won't get your records back. Give us some Bitcoin and we'll. Okay, what happens when they say, like, yo, we scanned your network and we know which IPs are the fucking life support devices. And if you don't pay the ransomware, we're going to shut that shit off. Like, when does it get to that point? Because all of that stuff is internet connected. All of it is on the network. The devices that dispense opiate pain medications. The DEA wants to track that shit. It's all internet connected. It's all on the fucking network. So if I really wanted to fuck somebody up, all I'd have to do, I mean, there's a bajillion terrible things, but just to give you one example of a doomsday, if I hacked that painkiller machine, I could accidentally dispense 100 milliliters instead of 10 milliliters and kill you. Like, there is nothing stopping that activity from taking place. And once you've crossed the moral threshold to write malware that's designed for healthcare, how much longer is it until they're willing to say, I am willing to take a human life if you don't pay me $10 million in Bitcoin? I feel like that's the next step.
Well, I think we're already there, actually.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned WannaCry earlier and how that took NIH hospitals offline. And then there's been permutations of that with NotPetya and some others where now they've taken that wide distributed, all right, WannaCry, here's the shotgun blast that we're going to attack all the things. And now they're customizing that and going after very specific systems, kind of like ICS data, where they're going after energy systems or infrastructure. Now they're specifically going after CAT scans, which have radiated material and high magnetism inside of them. They're going after, again, things that they could potentially weaponize within a hospital. So, or even look at a pacemaker. There are known exploits against pacemakers. So at what point, like you're alluded to, what point does somebody actually action on the insulin pump, action on the pacemaker, action on these different devices? Because there have been folks that there's known exploits against a lot of these vendors that are out there, proof of concepts that already exist. It's just one script kiddie that gets a hold of this code, gets it onto the person they want, and basically you're hostage. What are you going to do against that? You can't turn off the Bluetooth on your pacemaker because it's surgically inserted. Like, how do you protect against that?
Well, we've seen already where bringing down a hospital has caused 2 or 3 deaths because they had to reroute patients, right? So they couldn't go to that hospital. They had to go to another.
One, and they've since come out and said that patient would have died anyway, but still, the point stands.
Fair.
Yeah. Well, I think there was 2, so if they both were, but the point is the point. And on top of that, and I talked about it recently, where you look at these hospitals, and it's very upsetting because they kind of operate the same way some other systems do, where you can't get updated or patched or upgraded except for maybe quarterly, if that. And some of the applications are written on older operating systems, kind of like the banks used to be written on COBOL for how long? Like, it wasn't until probably the past 5 years that you got away from the green screen. So you look at these things, and I get it, it's expensive. But from a critical infrastructure, from a national perspective, securing hospitals and securing your education system, which comes down to the schools that operate as a business. I'm sorry, they do. You're getting how much money from me and you can't protect my data. There's a fucking problem there. You know, you look at these things, the hospitals alone should have a separate network for personal computers there that people work on that hold PHI, and then a separate network for the critical devices.
Well,
it doesn't operate that way.
It's not about having a separate network. It's about having logical segmentation that dictates what's allowed to talk to what in a logical, scalable fucking way. And I preach it all day long, every day. And it doesn't matter if it's like a hospital or if it's a manufacturing plant. The same shit, the same concepts exist, which is that a CAT scanner shouldn't talk to your servers, or a PLC in a IoT network in an industrial manufacturing plant shouldn't be able to talk to your laptops. Like, segmentation is not new. It's not sexy. It's often overlooked. It's unpopular politically. It's hard to do, but it needs to be done. And I will say it until I'm fucking blue in the face until someone listens, because that's the only way to protect in the event of a ransomware attack, your network from burning to the fucking ground. Is having logical segmentation policies in place that say, if this gets compromised, fuck it. It can't talk to anything else. Exactly. That is the only way, after it has all of your other defenses have failed, to protect your patients, to protect yourself. And it's only a matter of time. Attacking shotgun style a hospital network is effective enough if they don't have good backups. If they do, all they have to do is give you the middle finger, wipe, and restart from their backups. Yeah, it'll take them down for a day or two or a couple of days, but they will get back up. Where they will really do damage is if they really pay attention to the assets that they have access to. If they really pay attention and care that this device is operating under, indicators that it's a Hitachi CAT scanner, fine, you'll shut down CAT scans. But more to your point around insulin pumps and pain, medication dispensing devices and life support systems. Like, once they can isolate, and they already have this technical capability to identify and isolate the symptoms, that's where they really have you over a barrel if you don't have logical segmentation in place that says, okay, you compromised Joe Schmo's laptop. That doesn't mean you can fuck up my whole network.
Yeah. And I don't disagree. And I got to say, one of the things I found, and I'm not going to talk about who I worked for, but I worked for somebody that had a higher classified network and a regular network, and there was a gateway between the two. You can drop a document into a folder and it would do a virus scan. And if it passed that virus scan, then it was able to go over to the higher network. You know how many ways there are around antivirus and anti-malware? And you're going to tell me, you're going to allow me to transfer a file from one network to another? That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard of in my life. And I told them that. And they were like, oh, well, it does a malware scan. I don't care what it does. The fact that you have that gateway there, the fact that I can take a document from one network to a higher classified network is a problem. And they were like, oh, well, it's, no, dude, no. That is not okay, because that is a gateway for somebody to be able to drop malware in some way, shape, or form and get to your other network. Network segmentation is truly about cutting off all access and only allowing that outbound connection to what it needs access to. And that is it. Nothing else, no documents, no files, strictly this needs to talk to this server, and that is all. And this capability just blew my mind. I literally almost lost my shit on this company. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, you should not allow this at all. And they're like, oh yeah, it's allowed. We do an antivirus scan. You do a what?
Yeah, the whole concept of taking this network and that network and putting a single choke point and a single inspection point and calling that good, or feeling warm and fuzzy about being protected because you did that one thing is hilarious to me. And on a regular basis, I not only preach network segmentation from a logical perspective at a more macro scale, but I preach visibility pretty hardcore too. Regardless of what tools that you're using, we as an industry are guilty, all of us. We are all complicit in having created this notion that as long as you have a hard, crunchy network exterior and you know what's going on your endpoint, you're good. You're cool.
Yep.
No fucking problem. False. Fucking false. If you don't have any kind of east-west internal visibility to your network, you don't realize that Bob from marketing's laptop just started Nmap scanning all of the other devices in its VLAN. Hey, guess what? Bob doesn't know what a fucking Nmap scan is, and he never will. His device is compromised. But guess what? If his device and that activity didn't cross the threshold of a firewall, if they have some lame-ass, antiquated endpoint client that doesn't actually look for behavior, you're not going to see that shit. If you have no logical segmentation, bringing back to the original point, your network is going to go down in flames, and you're going to be left looking like an asshole in the news, wondering how it went down, when I've been telling you for 2 years not to let Bob from marketing's laptop talk to anything else.
Carolina, I'm loving you more and more. This is awesome. You get just as fiery as I do. I'm just trying to hold my tongue so everybody can talk. but I'm the same way. So Jason, on that note, because you're here too, like, I know
I'm having a blast. I like to think I'm like the calm medium and just letting you two run with it.
But I know you see these things because I know what you see, and I know where you're at in your training. How do you approach things like this? Because you see the different aspects within where you're at. How do you approach it in securing that differentiation?
So that's part of the reason that you see specialized orgs where you see individuals are now differentiating InfoSec and SOC, that you have SOC and you have TDIR as two different functions instead of, like on financial and stuff, it's one function. All right, we only need 3 people. That's all I'm going to pay for. It's one thing. But in your more cyber mature organizations, they're splitting those apart because the SOC, definitely look at the hard crunchy outside, try to identify what's going on, try to do the patch management, the day-to-day vulnerability assessment, things like that. But then your IR teams and your hunt teams, all right, go in and find the things we don't know about. How do we strategize and do optimization? How do we add isolated VLANs? Or can we do some route neutering or route redistribution in order to identify what's going on, black hole traffic? What kind of filters do we have in place? Are we just using a single web proxy on port 80 and 443, but we're allowing our users to change their port to a SOX proxy, so now it's not going through there whatsoever? Like, what does your configuration and stuff look like? It's all too often that I see DNS 8888
there it is
4444 1111. Like, they're not using their internal DNS, they're allowing the users or the VMs, which is even better, the virtual machine on that host with shared clipboard in between the two and shared drive in between the two, communicate all the way out to whatever it wants willy-nilly, and now they can download the file, completely bypass as an insider threat. Sorry, not necessarily malicious, but they're trying to get work done, and they're bypassing the security controls, not realizing or not caring that, oh, hey, I can do this thing just by adding a virtual container. And a lot of the security folks have not caught up to that yet, have not caught up to virtualization or external boundary pivoting or VPSs, things like that, where, okay, I can't do it this way, so let me go and use web traffic, or let me go and use a standard port, or let me redirect traffic as a user, and then I'll just do what I want anyway, trying to find ways around the different controls. But yeah, DNS is a fun one.
So one of
It's
the
always
things,
fucking DNS.
yeah. So one of the things that was funny was back when I was in the Air Force, I was in the Air National Guard for a while, and we used to bypass our proxies all the time in IT. Like, we knew there was proxies, and we would bypass them. We were in the Guard. We didn't care. And we were like, all right, whatever. And then the Air Force took over, the Air Force major. And they were like, all right, you're not allowed to do this anymore. And I made the mistake going in on guard duty one weekend. And I put in my public proxy of, you know, where I normally go. And I kid you not, within 10 minutes, I forget if it was a server guy or my trainer. He came up to me, he goes, hey, are you doing this? Yeah. Stop. I was like, dang it. All right, I'll quit. Because that's how we bypassed our proxy server, was just putting in a public proxy that was online and just bypassing out all the security measures. And it was back when I first got into IT. Well, not first got into IT, but when I first, you know, started in the career path, and was just like, there's things I want to do that I can't do on a military network because they block everything at the time. And so we bypassed it. And then they were like, yeah, you can't do that anymore. And it was like, dang it. All right, I'll quit. But yeah, seeing things like that and knowing that there's ways around, and going back to the internal stuff, one of the things when I've worked at MSSPs that we always did, was one of the alarms we would put in place was if you see a network scan internally. So coming from an internal network address, scanning any other internal network address, or even external, we would flag that, and we would say, are you aware this is going on? Because sometimes, yeah, it would be the security guy from his machine. So we didn't put in exemptions for it, just because if he didn't do it at that time, that meant he was compromised. So that was one of the things we did, is we would flag those internal network addresses doing network scans. If you see something from internal going from to one IP and going port, and checking, guess what? You're flagged. We'll put in a ticket, and then you let us know whether or not it's legit. And a lot of companies don't do that. They don't.
Nope. Most of them do not. I would say not a lot. Most of them do not. A. B, most of them do not know what is normal in their network. No. They don't know if a PLC in a manufacturing network is supposed to be using port 55 or 72. They don't fucking know. No. So if it starts acting out of turn, they also don't fucking know. They don't know if a laptop has started acting as a DNS server, because they don't pay attention to what's normal inside their network. Again, we have all helped to create this terrible problem where we think as long as we have a hard, crunchy exterior, as long as we pay attention to the endpoint, we're good. That is shown time and time again to not be the case.
But that goes back to, so Cylance was one of the first major behavioral analytic, AI, machine learning, whatever you want to fucking put a buzzword on it. It was one of the first ones that came out that said, hey, we're going to stop scripts. We're going to learn by machine and tell you what's normal. But if you didn't put a policy on it, companies just treated it as a regular anti-malware. And they just threw it on there and were like, oh, it's good. It's good. I've got Cylance. I'm good to go. And it was like, if you didn't put the protections in place and say what was good and not good, it was worthless. It is utterly worthless. There is no value to it if you install it and don't configure it. Unlike...
Well, even if you do configure it, though, let's say, for example, you are infected, a lot of users are just going out, okay, here's what I have today. Everything I have today is the good. So if anything changes, it's bad. Well, now that infection's part of your native baseline and part of your backups and part of your policies. And like you basically just built in the adversary into your entire infrastructure. And I've seen
and I will fuck you up further by saying, like, what about the endpoints you can't put a client on?
Yep.
So let's say you have it perfectly configured to alarm on all the perfect shit, and you perfectly pay attention to every single alarm it generates. Even in that world, there are going to be HVAC systems that you can't put a client on. There are going to be medical devices that run fucking Windows XP that you can't put a client on. PLCs in an industrial network that you can't put an endpoint client on. So what the fuck do you do now? You shrug and hope for the best? Come on, like, pay attention.
And that's where, and again, that's where baselines come from, right? Whenever you set up something, You should know the baseline of what is normal in your network. You should. And
yeah, but that requires specific tools that most companies do not deploy or own.
Well,
because they're worried about the endpoint and they're worried about the exterior.
And again, when I went back, going back to when I worked for an MSSP, I would be like, hey, we should put these MITRE alarms in play because there's a lot of TTPs in MITRE that unless we go through and research, we'd have to implement ourselves. And I'd be like, oh, well, they need Sysmon. Like they need all of the fucking Microsoft tools that I can't remember the fuck they're called, but basically Sysmon and everything else. And I'm like, okay, so tell them to install it. It literally takes nothing to install those and enable that shit. And they're like, oh, well, we can't. So then now you're telling me that we have to manually create alarms for all these TTPs. Well, only if they need them. Are you fucking kidding me?
There are a host of tools that exist. I happen to work for a company that sells one of them, so I'm, somewhat familiar with the space. But there are a lot of tools that exist that will ingest things like NetFlow data, JFlow, SFlow, IPFix, and tell you inherently based on network activity what the fuck is up, aside from what an endpoint client will tell you or what a firewall will tell you. Most companies just don't even realize that's a blind spot. Most companies don't realize that a next-gen firewall isn't going to save your shit from everything that exists. No. You need to understand, you need to block at the DNS layer when a malicious request gets made. You need to understand when that device goes to call out that you need to understand via NetFlow or whatever your internal telemetry is, what else that device has fucking been up to for the last few days, weeks, months, whatever. And unfortunately, my customers are drowning already on the number of alerts that they get from their other antiquated tools, and they haven't even, most of them, begun to take a look at anything beyond that and correlate that data and have any prayer of seeing shit that's been living in their network for months or years until it punches them right in the crotch.
Well, there's only two types of companies out there, right? Those that have been breached and those that don't know
breached
that
and those that don't yet. Yeah.
Yep.
That's all there is. And it's sad because, again, if you don't know your baseline, if you don't know when you stand up your network what is normal, and as new users come on, how data looks, you don't know when you're breached. And look at data going out. That is my biggest thing. When you talk about breaches and data going out, I'm sorry. If you see an increase in bandwidth at 10 o'clock at night of data being exfiltrated from your network or any bandwidth usage, and you are not flagging it, there's a fucking problem. There is a huge fucking problem. Because shit that does go out...
But you have to understand the concept of rate of... To set an alarm, you have to have a concept of normal to begin with. You have to have a concept of rate of change. So you have to understand that, okay, this device typically sees a gig of traffic a day, and today it's seen 10 terabits of traffic to China, and oh, by the way, SMB is open to the internet, and that's how it's using to communicate.
We flag that so much.
if you can't, understand that that's even happening, then you have no prayer to understand that that's operating outside the norm. You don't know what normal is.
And that's why I say MSSPs and MSPs are going to be huge, because companies don't know security. And we've seen there's a skills gap. Hold on, let me use two hands. There's a skills gap. No, you don't know what the fuck you're hiring, and you want a goddamn unicorn to do security and pay them $60,000 a year. No.
You want to sock in a person. One person, $20,000. Go ahead and do all these things.
Exactly. Right? So that's the fucking problem. When in reality, they're not going to find that person, so they're going to go to an MSSP. But then here's the next problem. We want to check the box, and we just want to pay you the bare minimum to make sure we're secure.
Well, is it secure or is it compliant?
Compliant.
There's a huge difference between the two.
Oh my God, we need a whole other hour. We need a whole other hour for that shit.
Oh my God.
Because I would say I would go out and say all organizations go for compliance, because that's what they're going to be penalized against. And if secure happens to fit in there, awesome. If it doesn't, hey, we're compliant. We're legally compliant. We're legally not liable for this thing. So it's definitely a difference between the terms of compliant versus secure, because they're not the same thing.
And I will also... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I will also disagree with you that there isn't a skills gap. There absolutely is. And unfortunately, I've seen so many customers, so just the sheer volume of what I've seen, I feel like at a macro level has shown me that. I worked in the public sector space for 6.5 years. I've only been in the commercial select space for 6 months, but I've seen the same thing over and over in that they will grab someone from the network side of the house that used to run the firewall or used to run the NAC, and suddenly they're a security person, but they're not willing to pay to send them to training to understand how to digest and put together telemetry and alerts in a security mindset and understand what those things mean. They take a network guy and make him a security guy, flying quotes, or lady, hopefully, although way less often statistically. We need a whole other hour for that. And they turn them into a security person. And at the end of the day, they don't have any fucking clue the difference between an IPS drop alert and an indicator of compromise that's outbound C2 traffic, and the difference between what that means and what they need to do with that information. And you're right, they will underpay if they can, particularly in this lead space, but in the commercial space too, just to have someone to keep the lights blinking, to keep the internet going, to keep the devices running. And unless they end up on the front page of the news, they don't really give a shit if they actually understand what they're looking at or not.
But you said the key word there. You said they moved them from networking to security with no training, no experience.
That's where some come from.
So, with that being the case, they weren't willing to hire outside. Now, I will say people should be promoted from within. I will always say that. Your department should promote from within first. If no one's willing, then go outside. Because you want to keep that customer loyalty and you want to, or employee loyalty, and you want people to know they have a place to go. But from the point of laterally moving somebody, there is no reason at all, unless that person has security training, to laterally move somebody from system administration or network engineering to security in any aspect. And that is where the problem lies. Because there are many, 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 many security people out there looking for a job, but because companies do not want to hire somebody that doesn't have a million certs for a junior fucking role, that is where my skills gap lies. When you're asking for a CISP for a junior security role, you are the problem.
Agreed, 100%. And I would say, to add to that, there's nothing wrong in the world. I absolutely agree with the concept of taking a network person and turning them into a security person, because you have to fundamentally understand how your network functions to understand how to secure it. But if you're going to do that, you need to pay for training. You need to stack up and pay for some training. Otherwise, don't act fucking surprised when you end up on the front page of the news, because you never bothered to teach them what they were looking at, how to ingest and take action on what they're looking at. And they really don't care unless they end up on the front page of the news. Or I actually had a team, I still have a team, one of my customers that of course I won't name, has basically disclosed to me, the network guys have said, oh yeah, the security guys were the network guys that we didn't like. So we pushed them off onto the security team. So it's not even talent-based or like merit-based. It's legit. Like, we don't want them to sit with us. We want them to go away. And thus we put them on the security team. Like, oh my God, what are you saying right now? Yeah, so those poor guys don't have a prayer, because, yeah, I mean, they know, how the wireless access points are configured, and they know, how the firewall ACL rules operate, and that's about it.
Well, that reminds me of the guy from San Francisco, somewhere in California. The network guy for the entire city got fired. Before he got fired, he was the only one with the password to the entire network.
Oh, yeah.
And he wouldn't give it up to his boss because he didn't like or trust his boss with that data. So he got put in jail until he finally gave it up to not his boss, but his boss's boss, which I guess he trusted more. But it wasn't before he got put in jail for holding the network hostage. And that makes me chuckle because, A, you had a single point of failure. And B, if your network guy does not trust you, there's a problem. And I think it went beyond him being fired.
I'll do you one better. One of my airports. So one of my city customers that controlled an airport, they only had one security guy. And he found out ahead of time that he was going to be fired. And so they actually have footage on the security cameras of him land jacked in to one of the servers with his laptop, leg up on a desk, doing, we assume, exfiltrating data. We don't really know because they didn't have the systems in place to track what the fuck he was doing. But he then proceeded to change all the passwords, wipe everything, and walk out the door whistling. I assume middle fingers to the sky. Like, I don't have footage of that, but holy shit.
Kind of ballsy.
That makes me chuckle.
Agreed. And he didn't go to jail at all. So it's amazing to me that the other guy actually went to jail. Because we knew he did it. We had footage of him doing it, but...
But that also goes into, if they had rights and there weren't any policies, or the leadership, the C-suite, wasn't bought into the process and didn't buy into security. All right, security is just this dead leg on the side because we're told we have to have it. NIST, CMMC, whatever regulation says we have to have this thing, but we're going to throw it over there and do the minimum. Well, if they don't put it into the business process, then yeah, and there's a lot of orgs like that are just now with COVID. Oh my gosh, everyone's working from home. Crap, now security is actually important. Well, it's this huge nightmare of, well, it wasn't important before because it detracted from the bottom line, but now it's important, and how do we fix all these things? But again, guy's not going to go to jail because can you prove intent, and can you prove that they broke a rule? If you can't prove that they broke a rule in your org, then
yeah. So that brings me. So we're at our hour, but I still have one more topic on that note that I want to cover. So I seen two things recently, and one of was talking to a buddy of mine. The other one was online, right, on Twitter. And I don't know, Carolina, if you saw the thread or not from Sniper Barbie, but essentially, they were trying to make home offices. How do I put this? You had to have a locked door. Legally, like a client was trying to make it to where you had to have a locked door and a separate office space that nobody could access and nobody could see your screens. And in your home. In your home.
Who's going to pay for that?
That was my point.
Was it CJIS by any chance?
I don't know. I know it was Sniper Barbie was the one that was on the call. And so I was like, if you're not paying for it, then deuces. Like, you can fire me. I don't have the money. And I was like, granted, me, I don't have a door on my office out here. I could see my kitchen and dining room and my kids randomly earlier in the call, I'd have to say goodnight, would walk up. So like you see a cat, like just chilling on my shoulder during a work call because I don't have a door.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
But how can you demand a home office, especially in this during right now, that, what you can only work remotely if you have a locked door that is separate from everything. Are you paying for it?
Yeah. The reason I ask if it was CJIS is that's actually a thing specifically within, I've not seen it within CMMC or within NIST or any of those other compliance requirements, but within CJIS, there is a requirement that dictates that you two-factor auth into any access to the federal databases if you're running a background check, unless you're in a secure facility, which they define as being behind a locked door. So that is easily enough subverted by saying like, oh, we'll give you a fucking, like, here's an RSA token, go to town. Like, you don't have to have a locked door. You're just gonna have to two-factor auth every time you log in. Too bad, so sad. Those are the regulations. So I can't imagine any other that would require them to be in a locked office.
Yeah, to do a structural change to your personal abode to
Fuck all
support
that.
a company
Right?
function. No, that's okay. Who's
That
paying
was
for
my
it? You're
take.
as part of my employment. Okay, so you're gonna give me a raise now,
Right?
Like-
Are you gonna pay for it? You gonna give me a grant to refurb my house? Like, okay. So that was one. All
Like,
right.
if it's that serious, provide a skiff, and I'll go to the skiff and leave my cell phone behind, and we'll call it a secure facility. Like, give me a break.
Exactly. So the second one is, with all this remote work, I've seen another one. Testing people's personal computers during a pen test because remote work authorizes BYOD.
So that depends on the BYOB policy. If
And the scope of the test.
Yep. So as part of network access control, if they're requiring you BYOD, you have to meet a minimum standard in order to connect to network resources. Then for a pen test, they should be able to test to that standard, but not above and beyond.
But here's the next question. What if it's not VPN?
Yep. What if
Are these people providing public IPs to that test?
Oh, then that's actually illegal.
Right. So I would say
there is actually a law against that. If you're not providing a service, then you're not allowed to do that, because now you're acting on behalf of an ISP, and under Title 40, you can't legitimately do that.
Yep. I was going to say, if you're requiring VPN, then that's a different ballgame, right?
Yeah.
Because the user is somewhat acquiescing to control of their device to the corporation for the right of using their private device. And I did have customers that had to do that at the very beginning of COVID, when it was like overnight, everyone was working from home. They were not fucking equipped. They were not ready for that shit. And so for maybe a month or two, until they could issue additional devices to users, people were logging in with their personal devices, and there was just no other way around it. Otherwise they couldn't work. And I got that, but I would say to them, like, all right, here's some bare minimum requirements you need to put on those devices. If you're not going to provide them a laptop tomorrow, you at least need to push them out a VPN client. You need to filter their DNS when they're not on VPN. You need to have some kind of endpoint client deployed. Let's fucking forget about even posture at this point, because it's their own device. But which you should worry about eventually. But like, until you can ship them a laptop, like, let's just, batten down the hatches as much as we possibly can. But if you're not requiring any of those things and you're still expecting users to use their own shit, you should be compensating them in some way for using their own devices, for the cost and maintenance and upkeep and whatever the fuck else you want to claim for using their own devices. And B, absolutely, a pen tester should not have access to all the private shit I have on my own personal laptop if I haven't signed up to use that for work and there isn't some limited scope to that test.
All right. That fills my questions, because that was actually my answer. So I can't even go any deeper because you hit all the points. So, saying that, we're at over our hour.
Questions that we were going to answer the way you wanted them answered.
We're at over our hour. Look, this is Security Happy Hour. I'm Cyber Warrior. We have Carolina and Jason Hurst. And it has been a pleasure, absolute pleasure, having everybody here today. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. Go ahead, check all the ways you can connect with any of us down below in the description. And I will catch you all next time.